Okay, this is podcast number 2 for standard 5.2. What we're going to take a look at in this standard is how scientists classify all of the various living things that we now find on Earth. So remember, biodiversity is all of the different species that live on Earth. And so it's been evolution by natural selection, aided by genetic variation and speciation, that has contributed to all of the biodiversity that we see on Earth. There are millions and millions of species that have lived on Earth at some point. Many of them are extinct, but all of them need to be classified in some way so that scientists can name them and figure out their evolutionary history. And so that's what we're going to be taking a look at within this particular podcast. Okay, so this huge variety of different species that we see on Earth, I mean, there's thousands of different kinds of birds and flowers and bugs and all sorts of stuff and all of it ends up needing to be classified. So in classification, we're going to organize and name all the species, extinct and living, that have ever existed on Earth, and we're going to show the relationships that exist between all of those species. So not only do we come up with a common name for every single living thing, we also show how all living things end up being related to each other. We're going to use a couple of different kinds of systems to do this, but the basic one is where we put things into domains and kingdoms and phylums, and we'll talk about that system. Okay, so what we can do is we can take a look at how different living things are related to each other by doing something kind of like a family tree. And here you can start to take a look at some of the ways we're going to classify them. But here we've got a bunch of animals that you might be familiar with, and this shows how they are related to each other. So there was a common ancestor back here that was a carnivore between a cat and a dog, right? And then back here there was a common ancestor between the dogs and the skunk and the otter. So you can kind of look at how these things are related based on where they fall within the classification scheme. So what scientists use today is called Linnaeus' system. This was a scientist that came up with how to classify organisms. And it categorizes organisms from a very broad description to a very specific description. And we've actually already learned about the first two parts of this, which are domains and kingdoms. Linnaeus did not come up with domains. That came later, but he did come up with the kingdoms. And that is the first, or the largest group of Linnaeus' system, is the kingdoms, and we learned that there are 6 kingdoms: eubacteria, archaeobacteria, protists, fungi, plants, and animals. So those 6 kingdoms are basically every single living thing falls into one of those 6 kingdoms. And we had talked about what the broad categories are. For example, if you're in the kingdom Animalia, that means your cells have no cell walls, you are multicellular, you're heterotroph, you reproduce sexually, those kinds of things. So these are the kind of big, broad categories that we have in the kingdoms. From there, we then go down to phylum, followed by class, order, family, genus, and then species. Okay, so kingdom is domain is the absolute biggest, and then you go to kingdom, and then from the kingdoms, you go into smaller groups called phylums, and then the phyla are categorized into smaller groups called classes, and then you get smaller groups called orders, and it kind of just continues in that way. So if you wanted to look at the scientific classification for a human, okay, we are in the domain Eukarya, so don't forget that because we're eukaryotic cells. So the domain Eukarya, and then kingdom Animalia. Our phylum is called Chordata, and that's because we have a spinal cord. We are mammals, so that's our class, so we're in the same class as whales and dogs and cats. Our order is primate, and our family is Hominidae. Our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapien. And actually, there's a further subspecies of this called Sapiens also, so we would say that humans are actually Homo sapiens sapien. That's the completely correct way of putting it. But basically, you can go from these really broad categories down into smaller and smaller ones, and you get more and more specific types of characteristics as you go into the smaller categories until you get to the ones that make up just the specific species. People come up with different kinds of ways to remember this, like king, Philip, Ken, order, friendlies, gourmet, special. I've heard all different kinds, but you have to remember what these are in order and which ones belong into which ones. So when we look at Linnaeus' system, we actually can use his system to come up with a scientific name. A scientific name is the name that scientists use to describe a species. And the scientific name is a combination of the genus and the species name for that organism. So for humans, we are in the genus Homo, and we are the species Sapien. So our scientific name is Homo sapien. So you just put those two together, and they're always written in italics whenever you write a scientific name. So classification today, we look at both evolutionary relationships and molecular biology. We look at the genetics when we are considering how we classify organisms into the smaller categories. So when we want to place things into the phylum down to species, we're going to take a look at how one thing is related to another, and we're also going to take a look at DNA. The DNA piece is a newer piece in classification. It has changed the way that we've classified some things. Remember also, we talked about this already, when we're classifying into the larger categories, into the domains and kingdoms, this is where we're going to consider cell type, are they prokaryotes or eukaryotes? Nutrition, are they autotrophs or heterotrophs? Are they unicellular or multicellular? Certain cell structures like cell walls, chloroplasts, things like that. We consider all that kind of stuff when we're going into the big broad categories. But then we start to look at more specific things when we try to go into the smaller categories. Now, one of the things we can do is when we start to look at how living things are related to each other, we can actually use a chart that shows the evolutionary relationships between different species. This chart is called a cladogram. And basically a cladogram starts with the oldest species down at the bottom, and then it branches off into more species that have formed over time until you get to your more recent species, which will be seen towards the top of the cladogram. So it's kind of like a family tree. It's set up a little bit differently. It doesn't branch off quite in the same way. But basically it shows how one species may have evolved to another and into another. And so in some ways it can show descent with modification of certain species, and other ones it's just going to show evolutionary relationships of the existing species. Okay. The shorter the branches there are between two species, the closer related those two species are. So if there's very little space between two species, that means they're highly or closely related. If there's a big space between the two species, then they're not very closely related. So let's take a look at an example here. Okay, so here is a cladogram that is showing a hagfish. This is a fish that still exists, but it evolved from a very ancient fish. And what we do is we say, oh, there's the hagfish, and then the hagfish got a characteristic called jaws. So it ended up getting jaws. Once the hagfish started to get jaws, then we got into our more modern type of fish like perch. Well, some members of the fish family started to get lungs, and so we got to our amphibians like salamanders and turtles. Salamanders and turtles started to get claws and nails so they could start to live on land, and those became our modern lizards. From there, the lizards either got feathers and became birds, or they got fur and mammary glands, and those became our modern mammals like mice and chimps. So if you look at this, the branch between the mouse and the chimp is short, so that means they are close related. Whereas between the chimp and the hagfish, that is a very large amount of space between those two, so that means they are the least related. So this is just a way of looking at how one group may have evolved, what kind of characteristic came about in order to make the next group come along. So there are still hagfish, there's regular fish that are still around. That just means that some of them went in this direction with the lungs, and some stayed in this direction and stayed regular kind of fish.